This video is brought to you by Brilliant. In the immediate aftermath of October the 7th, the only certainty in Israeli politics was that Netanyahu was done. His controversial judicial reforms and the subsequent political chaos had already made him deeply unpopular with much of the electorate. But Hamas's attack fatally undermined Netanyahu's reputation as the one politician that could guarantee Israel its security, and it looked like the final nail in the coffin. Nearly a year later, however, and not only is Netanyahu still in post, but the most recent polls suggest he's still many Israelis' preferred PM, and his Likud party, which were 20 points behind Benny Gantz's National Unity Party last October, have now regained their lead in the polls. So, in this video, we're going to take a look at Netanyahu's astonishing political recovery, and whether he could actually win another election. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's get straight into it and explain why Netanyahu has surged in the polls. The two main reasons are that 1. Israel as a whole has shifted to the right, and 2. The main opposition figures, especially Benny Gantz, have failed to track this trend. Let's start with Israel's tack to the right. Sometimes English-speaking media frames the war in Gaza as Netanyahu's war, with the implicit suggestion that Netanyahu is continuing the war against the will of the Israeli public for reasons of political self-preservation. While there might be some truth to this, polling suggests a majority of Israelis do indeed think that Netanyahu's decision-making is mostly driven by self-interest, Israel as a whole has tacked massively to the right, and Israelis generally support both the war in Gaza and the ongoing escalation in Lebanon. Polling suggests that 65% of the Israeli public now consider themselves either centre-right or right-wing, while only 12% identify as left or centre-left, with most of the remaining 20% or so identifying as centrists. Now, we should say this is just the latest expression of a long-running historical trend. Israel has been moving to the right since at least the 90s, both because Israelis are more right-wing on economic issues, or more capitalist, than they used to be, and because Jewish Israelis have become increasingly disillusioned at the prospect of a two-state solution, which was the left's main political project in the 90s and 2000s. Nonetheless, this rightward shift has accelerated markedly since October the 7th, as the focus of political debate in Israel has shifted away from questions of the economy or religious identity towards the war, an issue where most Israelis are pretty right-wing. Pew Research polling from May found that 39% of Israelis thought that Israel's military response in Gaza had been about right, and 34% thought it hadn't gone far enough, while just 19% thought it had gone too far. This polling includes Israeli Arabs, and when you just look at Israeli Jews, support for the war is even more overwhelming. Only 4% think the military response has gone too far, compared to 74% of Israeli Arabs. Similarly, 50% of Israeli Jews think that Israel should essentially occupy Gaza after the war, and just 19% see peaceful coexistence with an independent Palestinian state as possible. In other words, only 19% still support a two-state solution. While this rightward shift could have in theory benefited Netanyahu, given he's on the right of Israeli politics, most people still thought it would be the end of him. His approval rating plummeted, and polls showed that most Israelis wanted Benny Gantz, leader of the main opposition party National Unity, to replace him as Prime Minister. Polling from late 2023, for instance, found that in a head-to-head contest, 45% of Israelis would choose Gantz, while just 27% would pick Netanyahu, and that 57% of Israelis wanted early elections. Now, Gantz's main political advantage was simply that he wasn't Netanyahu. There weren't actually that many specific policy differences between the two of them. After all, they basically agreed on everything during Gantz's time in Netanyahu's three-man war cabinet, although Gantz was notably keener on Biden's peace plan, which is why he left the cabinet in June. Nonetheless, in the past few months, Gantz's appeal has waned. National Unity are lagging behind Likud in the polls, and in May, Netanyahu regained his lead over Gantz as Israelis' preferred candidate for Prime Minister. This is essentially because Netanyahu has been able to present himself as more right-wing than Gantz. For context, Gantz has had more centrist vibes, as someone who's more in favour of maintaining the status quo and protecting Israeli institutions. He's a former IDF general who spent most of the past few years calling for stability during the tumult of Netanyahu's judicial reform efforts, and he's always been more popular with Israelis who identify as left or centre. Originally, this allowed him to present himself as an anti-Netanyahu unity candidate. However, by constantly escalating and explicitly dismissing Biden's peace plan, Netanyahu's been able to present himself as the only politician willing to do what it takes to guarantee Israel's security, at least in the eyes of the Israeli right, while implicitly presenting Gantz as insufficiently hawkish and overly sensitive to international pressure. Netanyahu's escalation in Lebanon continues in this vein. Israel has evacuated some 70,000 Israelis from the north since the start of the war, a situation that most Jewish Israelis consider untenable. Accordingly, polling suggests that something like 2/3 of Israelis support escalation against Hezbollah, and Likud experienced a sharp uptick in the polls after the assassination of senior Hezbollah and Hamas leaders in late July, which has sustained as Netanyahu has continued to escalate in the north. This has also conveniently distracted voters from Gaza, where Netanyahu has essentially failed to live up to his promises of total victory and the destruction of Hamas. So you get the idea. Helped by the recent escalation in Lebanon, Netanyahu has successfully outflanked his main opponent in Benny Gantz, and other opposition politicians have been unable to land a glove. So what happens next? Well, Netanyahu's position looks remarkably secure. Not only is he more popular than the opposition, but he's also found a potential alternative to his unruly defense minister Yoav Gallant in Gideon Sa'ar, a former ally turned rival that Netanyahu is apparently considering bringing in to the war cabinet. Gallant has spent much of the past few months criticising Netanyahu for failing to come up with a long-term plan, but the prospect of being replaced by Sa'ar will now limit Gallant's political leverage. This means that Netanyahu will probably make it to the next election, due in October 2026. His electoral prospects will probably depend entirely on Israel's security situation. But if Netanyahu hasn't finished the job, polls now suggest his most threatening challenger would be former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. A religious nationalist closely associated with the settler movement, Bennett isn't currently involved in mainstream politics, but polls suggest a 40% plurality of Israelis want him as Prime Minister. If he were to win, a Bennett government would see Israel move even further to the right, both on how it prosecutes the war and its attitudes to settlers in the West Bank, likely exacerbating Israel's diplomatic isolation. What do the world's best politicians have in common? They're willing to learn something new every day. And if you think that sounds too hard or too time-consuming or just too overwhelming for you to do, then you haven't tried Brilliant.org. Brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data analysis, programming, and AI. Like I said though, the real value here is that you can do this easily every day, truly committing to lifelong learning. Slowly, over time, you'll not only pick up new skills or get better at maths, but you'll also feel the satisfaction that comes with bettering yourself and staying ahead. For instance, if like many world leaders, you want to get better at handling finances, you might want to check out the ton of new data science content Brilliant has just released, all of which uses real-world data to train you to see trends and make better informed decisions. They're perfect for learners of any level to start or continue learning data analysis, with a full suite of new content covering data visualizations, algorithms, regression models, and more. Plus, you can gain additional insight by working with real datasets from sources like Airbnb, Spotify, Starbucks, and more. To try everything Brilliant has to offer free for a full 30 days, click on the link in the description.